The planet Xyla 9 was a miracle of biological engineering gone horribly wrong. Originally a hegemony terraforming experiment designed to create a galactic breadbasket, the planet's flora had mutated. A surge of cosmic radiation had accelerated the plant's metabolic rates by 10,000%. On Xyla 9, a seed could become a tree in an hour. A vine could hunt a man like a serpent. But the most dangerous part of Xyla 9 wasn't the teeth of the pitcher plants or the thorns of the ironbark trees. It was the neural pollen. The plants emitted a bioelectric spore cloud that acted as a localized electromagnetic pulse. Any high-tech device, scanners, energy shields, hover drives, or neural links, was instantly short-circuited and then slowly digested by the acidic vines that followed the scent of ozone. The hegemony had sent 3 green-leaf pacification squads. They arrived in sleek, organic fiber ships with advanced biorepellent fields. Within 48 hours, the jungle had swallowed them whole. Their distress calls were silenced not by a jammer, but by moss growing over their antennas at an inch per minute. The target was Dr. Eris Vane, a rogue exobiologist who had committed the ultimate hegemony sin. He had deleted his digital identity and merged his consciousness with the planet's root system. Vane wasn't just hiding in the jungle. He was the jungle. From his throne in the heart of the canopy, he was directing the forest to expand, preparing to launch spore pods into the upper atmosphere to infect the nearby trade lanes. Admiral Krell's hologram flickered as he spoke to Silas in the Soot districts. Thorn, the planet is a graveyard of technology. We can't see Vane. Our satellites show a solid wall of green. If we try to fire a kinetic strike, the atmosphere is so dense with spores it would just trigger a global forest fire that would destroy the very samples we need to save the sector. We need a surgeon. A dirty, loud analog surgeon. Silas Thorn looked at the holographic map of Xyla 9. He wasn't looking for energy signatures. He was looking for the path of least resistance. The problem with your squads, Admiral, is that they brought snacks to a buffet, Silas said, cleaning a thick, jagged blade of a heavy-duty chainsaw. Plants like energy. They like heat. They like electricity. They're like kids in a candy store when a hegemony ship lands. And you? I'm bringing something they can't eat, Silas replied. I'm bringing noise, smoke, and chemistry that hasn't been used since the Industrial Revolution. The Iron Maiden didn't land on Xyla 9. It crashed with intent. Silas used the ship's heavy reinforced lead hull as a plow, slamming into a clearing near the equator. The sound of the impact was like a mountain collapsing. Within seconds of the engine's cooling, the forest responded. Through the reinforced porthole, Silas watched as the vines of hunger, thick, translucent stalks filled with glowing green digestive fluid, began to crawl across the glass. They didn't use sensors. They felt the vibration of the ship's cooling metal. They searched for a port, a wire, a signal. Silas sat in his pilot's chair and didn't touch a single button. He reached down and grabbed a heavy red-painted machine. It was a 20th-century-style chainsaw, modified with a high-compression combustion engine that ran on a mixture of ethanol and recycled ship oil. It was loud. It was heavy. And it was completely, gloriously mechanical. Rusty, stay on the winch, Silas said into the copper-speaking tube. If the vines get through the secondary hull, trigger the manual steam vents. Cook him. The clockwork automaton clicked its gears in a steady rhythm, its brass arms gripping the massive iron levers of the ship's internal defense system. Silas donned his gear. He didn't use a high-tech environmental suit. He wore a heavy suit of waxed canvas, treated with a thick layer of animal fat and salt. On his face, he strapped a simple rubber gas mask with a charcoal filter. On his back, he carried a 10-gallon brass tank connected to a manual hand pump sprayer. He stepped out onto the landing ramp. The air on Xyla 9 was a thick, humid soup of green light and neon spores. The moment the ramp touched the mud, the jungle screamed. It wasn't a vocal scream, but a collective rustle of millions of leaves, a vibration that Silas felt in his teeth. A cluster of siren lilies opened nearby, releasing a concentrated burst of bioelectric spores. If Silas had a neural chip, his brain would have been fried in an instant. If he had an energy rifle, it would have exploded in his hands. But Silas Thorn was a man of the old world. He gripped the starter cord of the chainsaw. Rip. The engine coughed. Blue smoke puffed from the exhaust. Rip. A sputter of life. Rip. From. The roar of the two-stroke engine was a biological insult to the planet. The high-pitched scream of the spinning steel chain echoed through the canopy. Silas stepped into the mud and swung. The first vine, thick as a man's waist, tried to wrap around his leg. The chainsaw bit into the green flesh. There was no shield to bypass, no armor to hack. Just the raw, physical force of spinning steel teeth against cellulose. Green sap sprayed against Silas's canvas suit, but the wax and salt caused it to bead and slide off before the acid could eat through. "You like to grow?" Silas shouted over the roar of the engine. "Let's see you grow back from this." He moved toward the center of the forest. The journey was a nightmare of physical exertion. Every step was a battle. The jungle tried every trick in its biological arsenal. It grew snap traps, massive toothy mouths in the ground that Silas triggered with heavy iron spikes before stepping over them. It released ghost pheromones, scents designed to trigger hallucinations in the mammalian brain. But Silas's charcoal filter was a physical wall the chemicals couldn't penetrate. He reached the Valley of the Weeping Willow, a place where the trees were so dense that the sun never reached the floor. Here the air was filled with a thick, purple mist. In the center stood Dr. Eris Vane. Vane didn't look human anymore. He was fused into the trunk of a massive, pulsating world tree. Vines were threaded through his ribcage. Roots had replaced his legs. His eyes were two glowing green orbs of pure bioluminescence. "Silas Thorne," a voice echoed, coming not from Vane's mouth, but from the very ground beneath Silas's feet. "I felt your vibration the moment you entered the system. You are a loud, clanking parasite in a world of perfect harmony." "Harmony?" Silas grunted, revving the chainsaw to clear a path through a wall of thorns. "You're a weed, Vane. And I'm the gardener. You bring a toy of iron and smoke to a god of biology," Vane's voice hissed. "The forest will digest your machine. It will turn your iron into minerals for the soil. Your bones will be the foundation for my next expansion." Vane raised his hand, now a twisted limb of bark and vine. The ground erupted. A dozen ironbark warriors, humanoid shapes made of woven, hyperdense wood, rose from the mud. They didn't have souls. They were just puppets controlled by Vane's neural link to the planet. The warriors charged. Silas didn't panic. He shifted his grip on the chainsaw. He used the machine not just as a tool but as a shield. The iron bark was tough, but it was still wood. The chainsaw roared, the steel chain smoking as it tore through the dense limbs. Silas moved like a boxer, a man of Earth's heavy gravity, using his density to deliver blows that shattered the wooden constructs. But for every warrior he cut down, two more grew from the earth. The forest was infinite. The chainsaw was running low on fuel. "You can't win, Thorne." Vane's voice boomed. "Biology is the ultimate machine. It regenerates. It adapts. Your analog world is a dead end." Silas stepped back, his back against a massive, acidic pitcher plant. He reached for the brass tank on his back. "You're right about one thing, Vane," Silas said, his voice muffled by the rubber mask. "Biology is a machine. And like any machine, it has a weakness. You spent so much time evolving your neural links and your bioshields that you forgot the basics." Silas began to pump the manual handle on the brass tank. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The pressure gauge on the tank rose. "What is that?" Vane asked, the forest's vines hesitating for a moment. "A poison? We have adapted to every toxin the hegemony possesses." "This isn't a hegemony toxin," Silas said. He pulled the trigger on the sprayer nozzle. A thick, white mist erupted, covering the ground and the approaching warriors. It wasn't a complex nerve agent. It was a concentrated solution of coarse sea salt, high-acidity vinegar, and a heavy dose of borax. To a high-tech ship it was nothing. To a hypermetabolic, bioelectric forest, it was a death sentence. The salt acted as a massive osmotic shock. It began to draw the water out of the plant cells at an impossible rate. The vinegar acted as a systemic acid, burning through the protective membranes that kept the neural pollen stable. The borax interfered with the plant's ability to process minerals. The reaction was violent. The ironbark warriors didn't just stop, they began to wither. Their green sap turned to a brown sludge. The ground beneath Silas's feet began to crack as the root system underwent a massive chemical collapse. What have you done?" Vane screamed, his physical form within the tree beginning to shrivel. "My link. I can't feel the forest. Everything is turning to ash." "It's called salting the earth," Silas said, stepping through the dying vines. "It's a technique we've been using since we were fighting with bronze swords. Your forest is fast, Vane. It grows too quick. That means its cells are thin. They can't handle a change in the soil's chemistry. You built a skyscraper out of grass and I just pulled the plug." Silas reached the base of the world tree. He didn't use the chainsaw this time. He took out a heavy iron hand drill. He began to turn the handle, boring a hole directly into the pulsating purple core of the tree where Vane's consciousness resided. Crack, Crack, crack. Once the hole was deep enough, Silas took a small glass jar filled with a concentrated copper sulfate solution, a blue liquid that was poison to any root system. He poured it into the hole. The tree let out a low, guttural groan. The purple light faded. The vines that had been wrapped around Vane's body went limp, dropping the scientist to the ground like a piece of rotten fruit. The jungle went silent. The neural pollen settled to the mud, inert. Vane lay in the mud, gasping. His eyes were back to their normal human color, but they were filled with a hollow, broken terror. He looked up at Silas, this man of leather and brass who had just dismantled a planet's worth of evolution with a bucket of salt and a hand drill. You destroyed it, Vane whispered. The harmony, it was beautiful. It was a weed, Vane, Silas said, pulling a pair of heavy iron handcuffs from his bag. And you're coming with me. The hegemony has a nice, sterile glass room waiting for you. No plants, no mud. Just the cold, hard logic you hate so much. He snapped the cuffs on Vane's wrists. The click of the iron was the only sound in the now-dead clearing. Silas checked his mechanical watch. 4 hours and 20 minutes. I'm definitely going to need to charge the Admiral for the extra fuel. The trek back to the Iron Maiden was easier. The forest was no longer hunting. It was dying. The choking green was turning into a silent brown. Silas walked through the withering canopy, dragging Vane behind him. He reached the ship. Rusty was standing on the ramp, holding a bucket of fresh grease and a heavy iron wrench. The ship was covered in dead vines, but the lead-lined hull was intact. Silas threw Vane into a small, reinforced iron cage in the cargo hold. He then walked to his workbench and picked up a rag. He began to clean the green sap from the chainsaw's teeth. The long-range radio hissed to life. It was Admiral Krell. Thorn? We've detected a massive drop in bioelectric activity on Xyla 9. The spore cloud is dissipating. What happened? Did you find the core? Silas took a bite of a stale protein bar and looked at the empty salt tank. The core is dead, Admiral, Silas said. Vane is in the cage. I'm departing the system now. And tell your scientists to stop trying to build a perfect garden. The universe is a dirty place. If you don't know how to handle a bit of salt, you don't belong in the dirt. Salt? Krell asked, his voice full of confusion. You used salt to neutralize a Class 10 biohazard? It worked for the Romans, Silas muttered, cutting the transmission. He sat in his cowhide chair and pulled the lever to ignite the chemical engines. The Iron Maiden roared, shaking as it fought its way out of the mud and through the dying atmosphere of Xyla 9. Silas looked at his watch. Tick, tick, tick. The galaxy was still obsessed with its smart solutions, its bioengineered futures and its Neuralink paradises. But as the analog hunter watched the stars appear through the viewport, he knew that the more complex they made the world, the easier it was for a man with a simple tool to break it. 5 down, Silas whispered to the hum of the engine. 7 to go. Rusty, get the water hose. I smell like vinegar and bad decisions. The hunt continued. And the choking green was just another chapter in the ledger of a man who refused to forget that in the end, everything comes down to friction, chemistry, and the strength of a human hand. The galaxy had long ago mastered the art of being fast. With hyperdrives, quantum processors, and neural links that could process 1 billion thoughts in a microsecond, the hegemony lived in a world where waiting was a relic of the past. But there was a darker side to this speed. A criminal named Malphas had stolen a piece of experimental achronal technology, a device that didn't just move fast but created a localized dilation field. To Malphas, the rest of the universe moved like it was trapped in thick syrup. He could walk into a high-security vault, spend an hour strolling through the lasers, take whatever he wanted, and leave before the first alarm sensor could even send a pulse to the central AI. He called himself the Master of Seconds. To the hegemony he was an impossible problem. Any weapon they fired, lasers, plasma, even guided missiles, became stationary objects the moment they entered his field. The hegemony's security bots, which relied on sub-millisecond updates from the grid, would simply freeze, their processors stuck in an infinite loop as they tried to calculate a target that existed between the ticks of the digital clock. Admiral Krell's voice crackled through the shortwave radio in Silas's workshop. Thorn, we've lost an entire sector of the central bank on the Chronos station. Malphas has turned the airlock into a stasis zone. Our enforcers are standing there like statues. We can't even get a drone inside to see what he's doing. He's mocking us. He sent a message saying he'll leave when he's finished curating the gold, and there's nothing in this century that can stop him. Silas Thorn was at his workbench, carefully winding the mainspring of a heavy, iron-bound trap. The sap from Xyla 9 was still stuck to the soles of his boots, and his hands were stained with the oil of 100 different machines. He looked at his mechanical pocket watch. Tick, tick, tick. The problem with your enforcers, Admiral, is that they're too smart for their own good, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. They're waiting for a signal. They're waiting for the computer to tell them it's okay to move. Malphas isn't stopping time. He's just jamming the frequency of the digital world. He's a glitch in your software. And you have a hardware solution? Krell asked, sounding desperate. I don't use frequencies, Silas replied, sliding a heavy steel bolt into a spring-loaded launcher. I use tension. A spring doesn't need to know what time it is to want to snap back. Physics doesn't have a clock, Admiral. It only has potential energy. And I'm about to give Malphas a lot of potential energy. The Chronos station was a haunting sight. As Silas stepped off the Iron Maiden, he felt the shift in the air. The station was beautiful, white marble floors, gold-leafed pillars and soaring glass domes, but it was a tomb of frozen moments. Near the entrance to the main vault, Silas saw a squad of hegemony enforcers. They were mid-stride, their glowing energy rifles raised, their faces locked in expressions of shock. A floating cleaning drone was suspended 3 feet off the ground, its anti-grav engine humming a single, unchanging note that sounded like a funeral bell. Silas didn't have a neural link. He didn't have an environmental suit with a digital HUD. He wore his heavy leather duster, his rubber-soled boots, and a simple mechanical respirator. On his back he carried a heavy sack of iron and steel. He took a step into the stutter field. It was a sickening feeling. It felt like walking through invisible cobwebs that were made of lead. His brain felt heavy, but because his thoughts weren't being processed by a chip, they didn't freeze. He was just a man moving slowly through a world that was moving slower. He pulled out his pocket watch. The brass gears were moving steadily. Tick, tick, tick. The watch didn't care about the dilation field because it didn't rely on a quartz crystal or a digital pulse. It relied on a physical spiral of metal trying to uncoil. It was a constant, unrelenting force. Where are you, you little ghost? Silas muttered, his voice sounding deep and distorted in the thick air. He reached the center of the vault plaza. There, in the middle of the frozen chaos, was Malphas. He didn't look like a master of time. He looked like a pampered aristocrat in a suit of shimmering blue silk. On his chest was the acronal device, a pulsing blue sphere that cast long, flickering shadows. Malphas was moving at what looked like normal speed to himself, but to the rest of the station he was a blur. He was casually picking up physical credit chits and tossing them into a bag. He saw Silas and stopped. From Malphas's perspective, Silas was moving in slow motion, but he was moving. Usually people in the field were as still as stone. A human. Malphas's voice echoed, sounding like a high-speed record being played back. How are you not frozen, mud dweller? Your heart should be beating once every hour in here. Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. His vocal cords couldn't move fast enough to respond to the fast time. Instead, Silas reached into his bag. Malphas laughed. You think you can catch me? By the time you raise that primitive weapon, I will have lived a whole day. I can walk up to you, take your gun, and disassemble it before your finger even touches the trigger. Malphas proved his point. He blurred across the room, appearing inches from Silas. He reached out to grab the Colt 1911 on Silas's hip. But Silas wasn't reaching for his gun. He had already dropped something on the floor. As Malphas stepped forward, his foot hit a thin, nearly invisible wire. In a digital world, a tripwire would be connected to a sensor. The sensor would send a signal to a computer. The computer would command a turret to fire. In Malphas's field, that signal would never arrive. But Silas's trap was a tension trigger. The wire was connected to a physical iron sear. When Malphas's foot pulled the wire, the sear moved. This released a massive heavy-duty industrial spring that Silas had wound up back on the Iron Maiden. Snap. A heavy steel bar, hidden under a pile of discarded silk, swung upward with the force of a falling guillotine. Malphas was fast, but he was still a biological entity. He saw the bar moving, but because the spring was releasing a physical, stored mechanical force, it wasn't affected by the digital lag he relied on. The bar didn't have a processor to jam. It just had 500 pounds of torque. The bar slammed into Malphas's shin. Crunch. The Master of Seconds let out a scream that started as a high-pitched whistle and descended into a long, agonizing wail as he was thrown across the floor. The blue sphere on his chest flickered. What did you do? Malphas gasped, clutching his shattered leg. Silas was still moving slowly, but he was closer now. He didn't fire his gun. He knew the bullet would just get stuck in the field. Instead, he reached into his sack and pulled out a series of heavy, magnetic iron weights, simple, solid blocks of metal with no electronics. He didn't throw them. He dropped them. Malthus tried to scramble away, but his leg was useless. He tried to adjust the acronal device to speed himself up even further, but his hands were shaking. Silas reached the master of seconds. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a heavy, mechanical dead man's trap over Malthus's torso. It was a device Silas had built specifically for this job, a heavy iron cage with a massive spring-loaded claw. The trigger for the claw was held open by a physical, ticking clockwork timer. Tick, tick, tick. "The thing about time, Malthus," Silas said, his voice finally catching up to the local flow as he entered the inner circle of the device's field, "is that it doesn't matter how fast you go. You're still moving through space. And space is full of friction." "I'll turn it off," Malthus screamed, his hand hovering over the shutdown switch. "I'll let the enforcers in. They'll kill us both in the crossfire." "The enforcers are waiting for a green light," Silas said, kneeling over him. "I'm waiting for a spring to release. One of us is going to be a lot more disappointed than the other." Silas reached out and grabbed the blue sphere. Malthus tried to pull away, but the iron claw of the trap snapped shut, pinning his arms to his sides. The mechanical force was so great it began to crush the expensive silk of his suit. Clunk. Silas twisted the sphere. It wasn't a digital override. He used a heavy pair of iron pliers to physically crush the mounting brackets. The blue light flared, turned white, and then shattered. The stutter field collapsed. The change was violent. Suddenly, the station's air rushed back to its normal speed. The frozen explosion in the distance finally finished its bang. The cleaning drone slammed into the floor. The enforcer squad stumbled forward, their rifles finally firing at a target that was no longer there. "Cease fire." Admiral Krell's voice boomed over the station's intercom. The enforcers stopped, looking around in confusion. They saw the vault plaza in ruins. They saw the Master of Seconds pinned to the floor by a rusted iron cage. And they saw Silas Thorne standing there with a smoking mechanical watch in his hand. Silas looked at the enforcer captain, who was still trying to figure out how he had moved from the hallway to the vault in what felt like a single second. "You guys missed the party," Silas said, holstering his pliers. "The target is secured. Tell your medics to bring a bone setter." My trap was a bit enthusiastic. The captain walked up to the iron cage, poking it with his energy rifle. This is just a bear trap. A giant, mechanical bear trap. How did our sensors not see this being deployed?" "Your sensors look for energy signatures," Silas said, wiping a smear of grease from his face. "This trap has the same energy signature as a pile of scrap metal. It's hard to find something that isn't talking to the grid." An hour later, the Iron Maiden was preparing for departure. The station was a hive of activity as the hegemony tried to catalog the recovered gold and repair the damaged systems. Malthus was being carried away on a stretcher, his acronal device, now a pile of broken glass and copper wire in Silas's pocket. Admiral Krell stood on the hangar deck, looking at the bulky, riveted hull of Silas's ship. "You saved the core bank, Thorne," Krell said. "But the Council is worried. You've proven that our most advanced security can be bypassed by a spring and some piano wire. It makes the hegemony look vulnerable." "You are vulnerable, Admiral," Silas said, leaning against the ramp of the Iron Maiden. "You've built a world where everything is connected. You've made it so fast that nobody knows how to handle a slow, heavy problem. You're so busy looking at the clock that you forgot how the gears work." Krell looked at the mechanical watch on Silas's wrist. "And what happens when the next criminal learns from your analog ways? What happens when the galaxy starts using hammers instead of lasers?" Silas smiled, a dry, knowing expression. "Then you'll have to pay me a lot more gold to fix it. Because hammers are a lot harder to hack than lasers." He turned and walked up the ramp. Rusty was waiting in the shadows, his clockwork heart clicking in a happy, rhythmic beat. The automaton held a physical ledger and a pencil, ready to record the day's earnings. "Rusty, check the pressure in the boiler," Silas commanded. "And find me a new mainspring. The one I used on Malthus was rated for 500 pounds, but I think I want 1,000 for the next one. The galaxy's getting heavier." The Iron Maiden ignited its chemical engines, the roar of the combustion echoing through the high-tech hangar like a roar from the past. As the ship drifted away from the Chrono Station and into the dark, silent void, Silas Thorne sat in his cowhide chair. He pulled out his pocket watch and opened the case. He watched the tiny, delicate balance wheel swinging back and forth, back and forth. Chapter 6, Silas whispered to the ticking of the watch. "Halfway there. Rusty, get the grease." We've got 6 more to go, and I have a feeling the next one's going to be a real grind. The analog hunter moved into the deep black, a man who lived by the tick of the gear in a world of the flash of the pixel. The galaxy was fast, but Silas Thorne knew the truth. No matter how fast you go, the past is always right behind you, waiting for the spring to snap. Nox Prime was a cosmic anomaly that the galactic hegemony preferred to ignore. It was a tidally locked world trapped in the shadow of a massive light-eating gas giant, but its atmosphere was the real problem. The air was saturated with obsidian particulates, microscopic volcanic glass shards that didn't just block light, they absorbed it. On Nox Prime, a laser beam would dissipate in 10 feet. A high-intensity floodlight would look like a dying candle. But the darkness wasn't just visual. The particulates were highly magnetic, creating a constant zero-point static that fried LiDAR sensors, scrambled thermal imaging and rendered night vision goggles into expensive blindfolds. For the modern citizen of the hegemony, landing on Nox Prime was the equivalent of being buried alive in a cold, silent grave. This was the playground of the Shade, a high-value assassin who had stolen the stellar iris, a physical lens made of compressed star matter used for the hegemony's long-range navigation systems. The Shade didn't need to be fast or strong. He just needed to be invisible. And on Nox Prime with his chameleon field stealth suit, he was a ghost among ghosts. Admiral Krell's voice had been tight with anxiety when he reached Silas on the shortwave. Thorne, we sent 2 elite recon squads. They were equipped with the latest echolocation drones and Eurolink mapping. We lost contact the moment they entered the Obsidian Valleys. The drones simply stopped. The men were found wandering in circles, their minds shattered by the sensory deprivation. The Shade is mocking us. He knows we are afraid of the dark. Silas Thorne sat in the pilot's seat of the Iron Maiden, winding his mechanical pocket watch. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was crisp, a steady heartbeat in the silence of space. The problem with your squads, Admiral, is that they trust their eyes, Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. They trust the machine to tell them what the world looks like. On Nox Prime the machine is blind. And when the machine is blind, the man panics. And you? Krell asked. How do you navigate a world of absolute shadow? I don't look, Silas replied, closing his eyes. I listen. And I touch. The universe is a very noisy place if you stop trying to see it. The Iron Maiden touched down on the black sands of Nox Prime with a heavy, metallic groan. Silas didn't turn on the external floodlights. He knew the obsidian dust would just bounce the light back into his eyes, blinding him. Instead, he waited for the engines to cool. He sat in the darkness of the bridge, breathing slowly, letting his ears adjust to the sound of the planet. Nox Prime wasn't silent. The wind hissed over the glass dunes like 1,000 snakes. The cooling metal of his ship pinged and clicked. Silas stood up and reached for his gear. He didn't put on a high-tech helmet. He took out a device he called the ear horns, a pair of large, polished brass funnels mounted on a leather headband. These funnels were connected to his ears by flexible copper tubes lined with silk. They were primitive acoustic amplifiers, designed to catch the smallest vibration in the air and channel it directly to his eardrums. On his back, he carried a large sack of tactile mapping wire, thin high-tension piano wire made of carbon steel. In his hand, he carried a simple oil lantern fueled by whale fat and kerosene. It didn't provide much light, but it provided heat. And in a world as cold as Nox Prime, a tiny bit of heat was a beacon of reality. Rusty, stay on the ramp, Silas commanded. If you hear a vibration on the ship's hull that isn't the wind, you trigger the steam burst. Don't wait for a scan. The clockwork automaton clicked its internal gears, its brass arms rotating as it gripped the manual steam valves. Rusty didn't have sensors. He had a physical vibration plate in his feet. If anything touched the ship, Rusty would feel the tremor. Silas stepped off the ramp. The world was a wall of black. The obsidian dust was so thick it felt like walking through a heavy, invisible fog. His lantern cast a flickering yellow glow that reached barely 5 feet. Beyond that, there was nothing. He didn't walk like a normal man. He walked like a blind predator. He took a wire from his bag and anchored it to the landing strut of the Iron Maiden. As he moved into the darkness, he unspooled the wire, keeping it taut. He was building a spider web. Every 50 yards, Silas stopped. He hammered a small iron spike into the obsidian ground and looped the wire around it. He then branched out, creating a complex, three-dimensional grid of steel strings through the valley. This was his analog radar. If anything or anyone moved through the valley, they would eventually brush against a wire. And because the wires were connected to the ear horns, Silas would hear the thrum of the vibration instantly. Hours passed. The darkness was absolute. Silas moved through the grid he had created, his fingers lightly touching the strings as he walked. He was mapping the valley not with light, but with tension. He felt the location of rocks, the slope of the dunes, and the hollow entrances of caves. Suddenly, a wire vibrated. It was a tiny sound, a faint plunk, like a needle dropping on a glass plate. It came from the northeast, about 100 yards away. Silas froze. He didn't turn his lantern toward the sound. He didn't reach for his gun. He slowly knelt in the black sand and reached for his ear horns, adjusting the funnels. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It was the sound of a cloak moving through the air. A high-tech stealth suit, designed to be silent, still had to displace oxygen. And in the dense, heavy air of Nox Prime, that displacement created a specific frequency of turbulence. The shade was close. "You're hunting a ghost, human?" a voice whispered. It didn't come from any specific direction. The shade was using acoustic projectors to bounce his voice off the canyon walls. "I can see your lantern. It is a pathetic little spark in an ocean of night. I can see your wires. I can see the steam from your breath. You are a biological beacon in a world that belongs to the unseen." Silas didn't answer. He didn't move. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small, heavy iron ball. It was a clatter bomb, a simple mechanical device filled with hundreds of tiny lead pellets. "I'm not hunting a ghost," Silas whispered to himself. "I'm hunting a man who thinks he's a ghost." Silas threw the clatter bomb 20 yards to his left. The device hit a rock and exploded into a cacophony of metallic rattles. The sound echoed wildly through the canyon. The shade reacted. He was trained to respond to movement and noise. He fired a burst from his suppressed energy rifle toward the source of the rattle. The purple bolts of light illuminated the obsidian dust for a fraction of a second, revealing a tall, slender figure in a suit that looked like a hole in reality. The shade had made his first mistake. He had revealed his position. But Silas didn't fire back. He knew the shade would move instantly. Instead, Silas reached for the primary wire of his grid, the master string, and gave it a sharp, rhythmic tug. Across the valley, dozens of small bells, hidden in the black sand, began to ring. The sound was chaotic, coming from every direction at once. To a man who relied on sensory precision, the sudden wall of noise was a physical blow. The shade panicked. He turned in a circle, his glowing violet visors trying to find a target in the static. "Show yourself. Stop this primitive noise." Silas was already moving. He wasn't following the noise, he was following the silence. He knew where his bells were. He knew where the wires were. He moved through the grid with the grace of a man who had spent his childhood in a dark basement fixing old clocks. He reached a point 20 feet from the shade. He could see the faint, purple glow of the assassin's visors. The stealth suit was trying to mimic the absolute blackness of Nox Prime, but because it was a machine, it had a refresh rate. Every few seconds the suit would flicker, creating a tiny ripple in the air. The shade raised his rifle, sensing a presence. "I have you now." Silas didn't draw his pistol. He reached for a large, heavy brass canister strapped to his belt. It was a magnesium torch, a device used by 19th-century photographers and miners. It contained a mixture of powdered magnesium and potassium perchlorate. "You've lived in the dark too long, Shade," Silas said. "Time to see the light." Silas struck a physical flint and steel striker on the canister. Tch boom. The explosion was not a bomb. It was a flash. A brilliant, blinding, white-hot pillar of light erupted from the canister, tearing through the obsidian dust like a sun being born in a tomb. For a few seconds, the absolute darkness of Nox Prime was replaced by a radiance so intense it felt physical. The effect on the shade was catastrophic. His stealth suit, designed to absorb and redirect light, was instantly overloaded. The chameleon field short-circuited, sending blue electrical sparks dancing across his body. But the real damage was to the shade himself. His eyes, dilated to the maximum to see in the dark, were hit with the equivalent of a nuclear flash. The shade screamed, dropping his rifle and clutching his face. His violet visors shattered from the thermal shock of the magnesium. He was no longer a ghost. He was a blinded, screaming man in a smoking suit. Silas stepped forward. He didn't need to shield his eyes for long. He had closed them the moment he struck the flint. He walked through the fading white smoke, his boots crunching on the black sand. He stood over the shade, who was rolling on the ground in agony. "The thing about being a ghost," Silas said, looking down at the assassin, "is that you forget how much it hurts to be seen." Silas reached down and grabbed the stellar iris from the assassin's belt. The physical lens felt cold and heavy in his hand, a piece of solid light recovered from the dark. He then took out a pair of heavy iron handcuffs. Click. The sound of the iron locking around the shade's wrists was the final note in Silas's symphony. The flash of the magnesium had cleared a small pocket in the obsidian dust. For a few moments Silas could see the valley. He saw his grid of wires stretching out like a work of art across the black dunes. He saw the ancient stone pillars of Nox Prime, carved by a race that had lived and died in the dark long before the hegemony was born. It was a beautiful, terrifying place. Silas pulled a small mechanical whistle from his pocket and blew a sharp, rising note. A moment later, the deep, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the Iron Maiden's chemical engines echoed through the canyon. The ship rose from the sand, its landing lights cutting through the darkness like two angry eyes. Rusty stood on the ramp, holding a heavy iron chain. Back in the soot districts, a week later, Silas sat at his workbench. He was cleaning the magnesium soot from his ear horns. The stellar iris was back in the hands of the hegemony, and Silas's gold was safely stored in his physical vault. The door to the workshop hissed open. It was Admiral Krell. He looked tired but relieved. "The Council is calling you the bringer of light, Thorn," Krell said, sitting on a wooden stool. "They don't understand how you found him. Our most advanced AI model said the probability of locating an invisible target on Nox Prime was less than 0.5%. Silas didn't look up. He picked up a small oil can and began to lubricate the gears of his watch. Tick, tick, tick. "Your AI models are built on logic, Admiral," Silas said. "They think in bits and bytes. They think that if a sensor doesn't see it, it isn't there. But the world isn't made of sensors. It's made of strings and bells and the sound of the wind. The shade is blind," Krell added, his voice lowering. "The doctors say the magnesium flash permanently burned his retinas. He keeps asking about the sun that hit him in the valley. He doesn't believe a human could have built such a thing." "Magnesium is just a rock, Admiral," Silas said, closing the case of his watch. "It's been there since the beginning of time. You guys just forgot how to make it burn." Krell looked at the wires and the brass funnels scattered across the workbench. "You're a dangerous man, Silas. You're proving that 10,000 years of progress can be defeated by a man who refuses to grow up." "I'm not refusing to grow up," Silas replied, a dry smile touching his lips. "I'm just refusing to go blind. In a world of perfect technology, everybody is a little too comfortable with the lights on. But the universe has a way of turning the power off when you least expect it." Krell stood up to leave. "The Council has another contract. A high-value target on the ocean of Mercury, planet. Extreme heat, extreme pressure, and a target that can mimic any liquid." Silas checked his mechanical watch. "Extreme pressure, huh? Tell them the price just went up. And tell them I'm going to need a lot of ice." As the Admiral left, Silas Thorne sat in the quiet of his workshop. He looked at the shadows in the corner of the room. He didn't turn on the electric lights. He reached for his old oil lantern and struck a match. The small, flickering flame cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Chapter 7, Silas whispered to the ticking of the gears. 5 to go. Rusty, get the heavy-duty sealer. We're going to a place where the air melts lead. The analog hunter stayed in the light of his small flame, a man who knew that the only way to beat the dark was to understand it. The galaxy was vast, fast, and digital, but it was still built on the foundation of the physical world. And as long as the gears kept turning, Silas Thorne would be there to hear the tick. The symphony continued. And the next movement was going to be hot. Vulcan 9 was a place where the laws of biology were considered a dark joke. It was a rocky world orbiting so close to its blue giant sun that the daytime side didn't have a crust. It had a soup. The oceans weren't made of water but of liquid tin, lead, and mercury. The temperature on the surface averaged 800 degrees Celsius. In this environment, a standard hegemony carbon fiber suit would ignite in seconds. A Neuralink chip would melt inside a soldier's skull before they even finished their first step. The hegemony had built obsidian towers, massive self-cooling research stations that sat on stilts of reinforced tungsten. But even these marvels of engineering struggled. They relied on active liquid nitrogen cooling loops that required constant AI management. If the power flickered for even a millisecond, the tower would turn into a molten tomb. The target was Calix, a phase shifter, who had been augmented with illegal liquid metal nanotech. Calix didn't just hide in the environment, he became it. He had stolen the Soul Core, a miniature fusion battery the size of a grapefruit that powered the entire sector's communication relay. Calyx had dived into the Sea of Tears, a massive bay of liquid mercury, and simply vanished. To the hegemony's infrared sensors, the entire ocean was the same temperature as Calyx. To their sonar, the liquid metal was too dense and turbulent. Calyx was a needle in a haystack made of needles. Admiral Krell's voice was distorted by the solar flares of Vulcan 9. Thorn, the Soul Core is overheating. Calyx is using the planet's natural heat to overcharge the battery. If it reaches critical mass, it will detonate, taking the research station and 10,000 scientists with it. We can't send drones. The electromagnetic interference from the sun fries their navigation. We need someone who can go into the heat and pull him out by hand. Silas Thorne sat in the Iron Maiden, which was currently docked in the shadows of an asteroid to keep the hull from warping. He was busy packing a heavy double-walled canvas suit with blocks of solid dry ice. "The problem with your cooling systems, Admiral, is that they're active," Silas said, grunting as he tightened a brass bolt on his helmet. "They fight the heat. They try to outpower the sun. On Vulcan 9, the sun always wins. You're trying to run a refrigerator in a furnace. I'm not doing that. I'm bringing a heat sink. Dry ice." Krell's voice crackled. "Thorn, that's carbon dioxide. It will sublimate in minutes in that heat." "That's the point," Silas replied. "As it turns from solid to gas, it absorbs the energy. It carries the heat away from my skin. It's a physical exchange, Admiral. No pumps, no chips, no logic gates to melt. Just a very cold rock getting warmer." The Iron Maiden dived toward the surface of Vulcan 9. The ship's heavy iron hull began to glow a dull, angry red. Inside, the temperature rose to a point that would have killed any normal citizen, but Silas had reinforced the interior with thick layers of asbestos-free mineral wool and a secondary water jacket. "Rusty, hold the altitude at 50 feet, Silas commanded. The clockwork automaton, its brass gears clicking at half speed due to the thermal expansion of the metal, gripped a large iron wheel. Rusty didn't have sensors to melt. Silas had adjusted his gear timing specifically for the heat of this planet. He was a machine built for the grind. Silas stepped into the ice suit. It was a bulky, white-painted monstrosity made of lead-lined canvas and several layers of reflective foil. Between the layers, Silas had stuffed hundreds of pounds of dry ice and physical ice packs. On his chest was a large, hand-cranked bellows. Every time Silas moved his arms, the bellows circulated the freezing CO2 gas around his body. He stepped out onto the landing ramp. The heat hit him like a physical wall. The sky was a blinding, violent orange. Below him, the Sea of Tears stretched out, a shimmering liquid silver mirror that reflected the blue sun with a brilliance that would have blinded a man in seconds. Silas wore a helmet with a thick, gold-tinted lead glass visor, originally designed for 20th century furnace workers. He lowered a flat-bottomed iron raft into the liquid metal ocean. It wasn't a boat, it was a heavy hollow slab of iron filled with water. As the raft hit the liquid mercury, the water inside began to boil, creating a cushion of steam that helped the raft stay afloat and kept the metal from melting through. Silas stepped onto the raft. He felt like he was standing on the surface of the sun. The dry ice in his suit began to hiss, thick plumes of white vapor erupting from the pressure valves in his shoulders. To anyone watching, Silas looked like a smoking ghost drifting across a silver sea. He didn't have a radar. He had a thermal harpoon, a heavy hollow spear made of tungsten, filled with a highly reactive chemical salt that turned bright blue when it touched something even slightly cooler than the surrounding metal. "Calyx?" Silas shouted, his voice muffled by the thick brass helmet. "I know you're down there. You're a biological entity, no matter how much liquid metal you've got in your veins. Your core temp is 37 Celsius. This ocean is 800. You're like a cold spot in a bowl of soup." The silver ocean remained silent. The waves of liquid mercury rose and fell with a heavy, oily grace. Silas began to pull a lever on a mechanical bellows mounted on the raft. The bellows was connected to a long copper pipe that dipped into the liquid metal. Every time Silas pumped the handle, it injected a blast of pressurized liquid nitrogen. Liquid Silas had brought in heavy vacuum-sealed canisters, directly into the mercury. The liquid nitrogen expanded instantly, creating violent explosions of silver spray and frozen mercury shards. Silas was flash freezing the ocean in small patches. He was looking for a reaction. Suddenly, a wave rose 20 feet away. It didn't fall back into the sea. It began to take shape. A tall, slender figure made of shimmering liquid silver emerged from the depths. It had no face, only a smooth, reflective surface. "You are a fool, human," The voice of Calyx echoed through the heat haze, sounding like the vibration of a tuning fork. I am the ocean. I am the heat. Your little ice suit is already dying. I can feel the gas escaping your valves. You will be a scorched husk within the hour. Calyx lunged. He didn't use a weapon. He turned his arm into a long liquid whip of mercury and lashed out at Silas's raft. Silas dived to the side. The whip hit the iron deck, the extreme heat of the liquid metal scorching the surface. Silas didn't fire a gun. He grabbed his thermal harpoon and waited. You're not the ocean, Calyx, Silas grunted, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the dry ice inside his suit began to dwindle. You're a machine. And even a liquid machine has to process data. And processors hate thermal shock. Calyx rose from the waves, his form becoming more solid, more human-like as he prepared to board the raft. He reached out a silver hand, intending to melt through Silas's helmet. Silas pulled the trigger on the harpoon. The tungsten spear didn't fly at Calyx's head. It dived into the liquid mercury right at Calyx's feet. The chemical salt inside the spear reacted. The area around Calyx's lower half turned a brilliant, glowing blue. It was a cold point. Silas had triggered a localized endothermic reaction. Calyx screamed, a high-pitched, electronic screech. The liquid metal that made up his legs began to solidify. He was becoming trapped in his own body. The silver shimmer turned into a dull, frosted gray. What is this? Calyx gasped, his upper body still liquid, but his lower half now a jagged, frozen statue of mercury. It's called a phase change, kid, Silas said, standing up. He was sweating buckets inside the suit, the last of his dry ice venting in a desperate cloud of white. You spent so much time becoming the liquid that you forgot what happens when you turn back into a solid. Silas didn't stop there. He reached for a secondary device, a large, pressurized canister he called the Blizzard. It was a simple mechanical sprayer filled with a mixture of liquid nitrogen and crushed dry ice pellets. He opened the valve. A roaring torrent of absolute zero mist hit Calyx. The phase shifter didn't have time to adapt. His biological core, already struggling to maintain his form in the extreme heat, was hit with a thermal shock of nearly 1,000 degrees in the opposite direction. The silver thief turned into a block of ice. Calyx didn't die, but his nanotech shut down to prevent a total system collapse. He was now a solid, frosted statue of mercury, pinned to the iron raft. In his chest, the stolen soul core flickered, its orange glow visible through the layers of frost. Silas checked his mechanical watch. The glass was hot to the touch. 10 minutes left. Rusty. Get the crane down here. The Iron Maiden dived through the orange clouds, its rusted crane hook swinging wildly. Silas grabbed the hook and hammered it into the frozen mercury block at Calyx's feet. Up. Silas shouted. The winch groaned as it pulled the heavy, frozen mass of the thief and the stolen battery into the air. Silas scrambled onto the ramp just as the raft beneath him finally began to buckle and melt into the sea of tears. Inside the Iron Maiden, the temperature dropped back to a manageable 60 degrees. Silas collapsed onto the floor, his ice suit hissing as the last of the dry ice vanished. He pulled off his helmet, his hair matted with sweat, his face red from the heat. Rusty stood over him, holding a bucket of actual frozen water ice. Silas grabbed a handful and pressed it to his forehead, letting out a long, shaky breath. Target secured, Silas wheezed. He walked to the cargo bay. Calyx was still frozen, a silver statue in a reinforced iron cage. The soul core was resting in a secondary cooling chamber Silas had prepared, a simple lead box filled with ice and salt. The long-range radio hissed. It was Admiral Krell. Thorn? We see the ship rising. Did you get the battery? The station's power is at 5%. Silas looked at the grapefruit-sized device, now glowing a peaceful, steady blue in the ice. I've got your battery, Admiral, Silas said. And I've got your thief. But you're going to have to wait for him to thaw out before you can question him. And I'd recommend a very, very strong set of magnets for the cell. How did you survive the surface, Thorn? Krell asked, his voice filled with genuine awe. Our model said the suit's passive cooling should have failed 3 minutes before you reached the target. Silas looked at the empty dry ice bags and the mechanical bellows on his chest. Your models don't account for spite, Admiral, Silas said. And they don't account for the fact that a human can breathe through a furnace if he knows there's a cold beer waiting for him at the end. Krell laughed. The beer is on the hegemony, Mr. Thorn. Come on in. A week later, Silas was back in the soot districts. He was sitting at his workbench, replacing a warped gear in his mechanical watch. The heat of Vulcan 9 had been the toughest test yet, but the watch was still ticking. Tick, tick, tick. The door to the workshop hissed open. It was Admiral Krell, looking more formal than usual. "The Council is calling it the miracle of the molten sea," Krell said, placing a heavy bag of gold bars on the table. "They want to know if you can consult on a new set of thermal suits for the Enforcers. They're impressed by your dry ice method." Silas didn't look up from his watch. "Tell them to save their money. My suit works because it's simple. You give that suit to a guy with a neural chip and a digital HUD, and he'll spend so much time looking at the temperature display that he'll forget to move his arms. The secret isn't the ice, Admiral. It's the man inside it." Krell nodded, understanding. "Calix is in the void prison. They've got him in a magnetic field that keeps his nanotech from forming a solid shape. He's just a puddle of silver now. He hasn't spoken a word since he thawed out." "He's got nothing to say," Silas muttered. "He thought he was the future. He thought he was untouchable. Then he got hit with a bucket of ice and a tungsten spear. That's a lot for a god to process." Krell turned to leave but stopped at the door. "Thorn, we found another one. A target on the Gravity Well planet. A world where the gravity is so high that light itself bends. They call it the pressure cooker." Silas checked his mechanical watch. He thought about the heat of Vulcan 9, the darkness of Nox Prime, and the silence of the clouds. He looked at Rusty, who was currently oiling his own gears with a rhythmic click whir. "A pressure cooker, huh?" Silas said, a dry smile touching his lips. "Tell them the price just doubled. And tell them I'm going to need a lot of steel cable. The heavy kind." As the Admiral left, Silas Thorne sat in the quiet of his workshop. He reached for his Colt 1911 and began to clean it. The galaxy was getting more complex every day, more digital, more perfect. But the universe was still made of heat, pressure, and the cold, hard laws of physics. And as long as those laws were in effect, there would always be a place for a man with a hammer and a watch that never skipped a beat. Chapter 8, Silas whispered. 4 to go. Rusty, get the heavy grease. We're going to a place where a man weighs 1,000 pounds. The hunt continued. And the analog hunter was ready for the wait.